Hello and welcome to our second section of our full stack Kotlin course, where we are developing a full stack Kotlin application using Spring on the backend and React on the front end. In this section we'll be touching Spring Web and how it plays together with Kotlin. We'll add Spring Web to our project and create few standard annotation based Spring controllers. We'll also serve HTML pages using the Kotlin HTML DSL. And we'll refactor our controllers to be functional Spring controllers that uses the new Kotlin DSL that was added to Spring 5. Finally, we'll discuss a little bit about RESTful API design and if we are able to create the generic API structure. In this video, we'll be talking about Kotlin and Spring controllers. We'll set up dependencies for Spring Web and create our first Spring RESTful controller. We'll also serve content from our first API endpoint and see how the browser responds to that. And finally, we'll add Spring DevTools to our application as well and see if we can increase the velocity of our development, which is useful especially on server side. Previously, we created a command line application where we injected hello sayer service comes from a different component to have our context completely separated. Our service actually does nothing else than print out hello world to the console, and in this video we'll be taking it one step further and actually returning the string into the browser using embedded Tomcat server. To have Spring Framework Web to our project, the change we need to make is actually very small. So we had Spring Boot Starter in here, now we'll add -web behind it, and that will actually make our Spring Boot Web available to us. We'll also add Spring Boot DevTools to the project. With these DevTools we can modify our classes and hot swap them if there are minuscule changes. It is useful especially in big applications where your server startup time could be tens of seconds. Now that we have Spring Boot Web, we can create our first controller, so let's call that Hello Controller, and that is a Kotlin class. This class will be annotated with RestController annotation, so we'll be serving in JSON from our controller endpoint. Note that we don't need to use the open keyword here because we still have our Kotlin Cradle Spring plugin. And note that this indeed needs to be opened up class because we are using Spring annotations in here. Our endpoint, we will be creating one of them, and that will be a get endpoint, and let's call that get endpoint say hello. So because we are using get mapping annotation, we don't define the actual value, our endpoint will be available at the root of the context or the root of the server. Our say hello return an empty string from here, but because we actually have the Spring context available for us already, we can just inject our hello sayer and use that to return our string. So we'll use the hello sayer object and call the say hello function. Note that this is currently underlined because our say hello is actually returning a unit instead of a string, so we'll do some refactoring in there. Let's jump into the interface and make it return a string, and the same story for our implementation. Note that this string in here on the green background, it is actually IntelliJ type hint, which is a very useful feature, especially if you are new to Kotlin and you are familiar with Java's way to over explain your types in your application. Now we have everything set up, so we have our controller responding to GET requests at the root of our server and responding using our service. Because that is there, we can actually modify our command line runner, and the only thing that is needed in here anymore is the actual class name and our Spring Boot application annotation. Previously we ran our application through command line. Now we'll take one step further and use the IDE to run. So in here we have lists of our Cradle modules and their tasks. The task we want to run is boot run, the same we were running through our command line. We'll run this in debug mode. This is an IntelliJ Gradle plugin that automatically runs the needed Gradle task, and in this case the Gradle task does all the expected things that we are already familiar with, so it'll compile our Kotlin code and spin up our Spring context. Note how our new build process is injecting dev tools to our application. It'll also start up a servlet for us. So we are using config servlet web server application context from Spring. We will also get a Tomcat injected in there, and then we have a few automatic request mappings in here, so error pages, etc. Finally, we can see that embedded Tomcat has started and it is available for us at port 8080. Now, if we jump into the browser, we can try to take a look if we will get our hello world returned to us. So port 8080 and the hello world is actually in there. That is string coming out from our controller. Now let's take that one step further and pass in a request parameter from the browser. We'll go back to our controller and add a new annotation within our function arguments. That is called a request param, and we'll give that a name. In this case, the name will be name, and we'll map that into a value called name. To use that, we'll pass that into our service. Note that IntelliJ tells us a hint we want to refactor our service function, so we'll let IntelliJ help us with that. And finally, in our implementation, instead of returning hello world, we use a string interpolation and return hello name. If we hit Ctrl Shift F9, we can recompile our Kotlin code and we can give a try for our dev tools to actually hot swap applications or classes. Note how you saw the hot swap failed from IntelliJ in there. So that is actually IntelliJ's hot swap functionality, and that is not related to Spring Boot DevTools. Now DevTools has failed to hot swap our classes, so that means we need to restart our application manually. We'll do that and compile the Kotlin code and spin up the dev context, the Spring context. In this case, the context spin up is fairly quick because the application itself is very small still. So it'll be only a few seconds to spin up our web server and start serving our application. If we jump back into the browser and take another tab from here, so in here we have our name passed in and we will be expecting Jussi. So let's change that and return hello packed. And that indeed works as expected.